Hello, another drawing tutorial here. I'm going to follow up a little bit on the short straight lines idea, as well as talk about a way to make pretty accurate, pretty quick freehand squares. And it's going to introduce a concept of using our pencil to measure the distance of something and then transfer that distance to another area. So, get a fresh piece of paper. You can see I have my kneaded eraser here. It's kind of handy that these things are sticky. And they will just sort of sit there and be happy for a long time until you need to use them. So on the short straight lines, I know that I talked about for the vertical, I think I'm going to start calling them plumb lines because these are really just guidelines, construction lines that will go straight up and down, oriented to the our drawing paper. The verticals, I'm sort of using my fingers. Another thing I like to do is sneak up on it. You can tell I'm sort of sketching it first. It's certainly good to be able to do a single stroke and be competent and confident with that. But I find most of the time it helps if I sort of, like a baseball player, baseball batter or something, warming up. I usually ghost it a couple times and then draw it. Ghosting, hopefully it makes sense. Sketching so light that it's ethereal and ghost-like, I guess. I never really looked that up, but... And then when I'm, I know when I talked about horizontal, I did talk about pivoting at the elbow, but especially if you're making short, straight lines, I really am using this as my pivot point, this part of the that part of the pad of my hand, and I'm just pivoting at my wrist. So like I said, pages and pages of this, while not that exciting, is really critical. On a similar note, sketching fairly quick and accurate squares, the idea is going to be to start out with basically what we've been talking about, to create one set of parallel lines, either perpendicular or, excuse me, either horizontal or vertical. And then when I'm comfortable with those lines, I'm going to introduce one line in the opposite direction, and then I'm going to be using my pencil to measure the length of that top horizontal, and I'm going to bring it down here It's a bit of an awkward angle, but I'm going to use it to try to make a mark as to how to make sure that the length of this line is now the length of this line. And hopefully that's nothing new to you, that a square is made up of two sets of parallel lines that are all the same length. So it can be, it seems like I usually start out with verticals and then either horizontal. This is a good example of just kind of going too quickly and really making some vertical lines that, actually all straight lines that really weren't that accurate with true horizontal and true vertical. So I did kind of check it out and come back, clean those up, and then I'm going to measure that distance. It's a bit of an odd skill, and it's kind of a personal thing, but it's certainly thinking about where the tip of the pencil is, and usually it's my thumbnail. When you're doing really small stuff like this, it gets pretty cramped. More and more I like learning these concepts at a size that is not threatening. Not to start off saying, okay, we need to learn how to make squares. This is certainly one of the goals, is to be able to make a square. But for example, if your pencil's not quite even long enough, then you could certainly use your to get a rough estimate with your fingers. But I digress. Keep it small and simple, and do the get the idea down first. And get it so you can really sort of not even think about it. Eventually I'm going to encourage you to first try eyeballing it, using your eye, and then using that measuring technique to test it. And when I'm thinking about just trying to use my eye to create a square, in my mind I'm kind of thinking about how far down this is going to go, and I usually try going a little bit too long, so it's like, no, that's not square, and then a little bit too short, and then it usually ends up, for me, kind of in a place where I can no longer think of it as wider, too wide or too tall, and then I can come back and kind of check. So this is quick and relatively quick and relatively accurate. But just these kinds of skills, these little techniques and tricks, I feel like I missed that part of art school or something. I'm not sure. This may be sort of common knowledge to a lot of folks, but I know it wasn't to me. I keep meaning to sort of do it in the other direction here. Just a sec. I'm going to do that one. So I'm more comfortable starting with the verticals, like I say, but there is nothing against starting with the horizontals and doing the same sort of thing. Like I say, these small sizes getting. I would practice it. I would certainly get the concept down at whatever size kind of makes sense, and then try going a little bit bigger so that the measuring piece of it is not too scrunched up and awkward. And I'm just using my eye, and I'm kind of remembering where that thumb nail is. Maybe making a mark first and then coming back and testing it. So this is going to come in great in all sorts of situations. Anytime, well, not the least of which is anytime you need to draw something square. But even more common, or an even more helpful or good reason to have this skill in your bag of tricks is because when we do start drawing more and more things, we're going to be starting to really think about the proportions. And I find it extremely helpful to just think of, a lot of times people hear the word proportion and they go, math, I'm scared. That's my impression of a scared math person. And there's certainly things that I have that kind of reaction to. So I just think of it as just friendly little squares. I just said friendly little squares. Wow. But when we start drawing items that are we have sort of measured and realize that the proportion of the short side to the long side is 1 to 1, 2, 3. That can start getting into that proportion weird stuff, and it's kind of nice to just be able to build how many squares. When we're starting to figure out just what the proportion of a given rectangle is, I like to start off by just thinking of what is the biggest square I could fit into this shape, and I could either measure that and measure it over here, or this one and measure it over here, make a little indication mark. So that is pretty darn close to, you might say 2 to 1, but I'm going to call it like a horizontal rectangle, and I still like, I like using the short side as always just 1. The shorter of the, not the shorter between this and this, but the shorter of the pairs. So this pair is shorter than this pair. So that's always 1 to 2. That's how I like to think of it. You can figure out what makes sense for you. But I want to do a different example because that ended up too clean, because most of the time it's not going to be that clean of a number when you're doing the proportion stuff. So this, I can tell, is slightly taller than it is wide. I'm eyeballing that. I think that's right. So this set is going to be the shorter. I almost just blew it there when I was measuring. So I'm going to measure that. Great, it's square. Okay, let me try. That's too square. Let's try that again. There. That is not square. I'm fairly confident. Most of the time, you're going to end up with these rectangles that are like 1 to 1 and I don't know what that is. That is probably about a fourth, 1 1/4. But that starts getting, especially when I start introducing fractions, that's, man, you think the word proportion can freak people out. But I just like to think of it initially as, let's see how many squares. And then that seems to be not so scary. And lastly, especially when we get into circles and spheres, a square is going to be extremely helpful. Because a perfect circle will fit inside a perfect square. And a sphere is nothing more than a three-dimensional circle with shading. We will get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. Hey, look, I need an eraser. Go see my other videos on the foundational three-dimensional structures. Anyways, there you have it. Short straight lines. Quick. Pretty quick, pretty accurate squares. Using our pencil as a measuring tool. And go knock yourselves out.